In March 2026, the theoretical nightmare finally became a reality. The Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide artery carrying 20 million barrels of oil every single day, was choked off. In an instant, the global energy market was paralyzed. But the most terrifying part of this crisis isn't that it happened, it's that we saw it coming from a mile away. For decades, every world leader, military strategist, and oil executive knew this exact waterway was a ticking time bomb. They understood the catastrophic cost of losing it. So, they prepared. The Gulf states had the billions, engineers drew up the blueprints, governments debated transcontinental pipelines, and $200 billion mountain canals, massive enough to redraw the map of the Middle East. The backup plans were fully designed. There was only one problem. They just never built them. The real question today is not whether the danger was visible, it was blindingly obvious. The question is, why, after 40 years of warnings, is the entire global economy still held hostage in a bottleneck we always knew could fail? Look at the map. The problem is geographical, and it is absolute. The Persian Gulf has only one exit. Iran sits to the north, Oman and the UAE to the south. At its narrowest, the Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide, but that is an illusion. For massive commercial supertankers, the usable space is squeezed into just 2 shipping lanes, one in, one out. Each is barely 2 miles across. The entire global energy system is being threaded through a 2-mile needle, and almost everyone is trapped inside. If the Panama Canal closes, a ship can still sail around South America. It costs more, but the route exists. Hormuz is different. If you load a tanker in Kuwait, Bahrain, or Iraq, there is no maritime detour. If the strait closes, a fully loaded tanker is just a floating warehouse. The scale of what is trapped is staggering. 20 million barrels of oil every single day. Add in 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, and you realize major economies like China, Japan, India, and Europe are entirely at the mercy of this corridor. The Panama Canal handles 5% of global trade. Hormuz is not a trade shortcut. It is the jugular vein of the global economy. And right now, that vein is being squeezed. Hormuz is no longer acting like a strait. It is acting like a valve. And Iran's military is deciding who gets to pass. The terrifying core of this crisis is simple. The world built its energy empire around a single, fragile exit door and never bothered to build a fire escape. To understand why, we have to look at the decades of warnings we chose to ignore. This isn't a new nightmare. To understand the chaos today, you have to look at the 1980s. During the Iran-Iraq War, the world got its first brutal glimpse of just how vulnerable the Strait of Hormuz could become. In what became known as the Tanker War, nearly 450 commercial vessels were attacked and damaged. The response wasn't a global master plan, it was a panic button. Saudi Arabia scrambled to build the East-West pipeline in 1981. The truly chilling part? Over 40 years later, that 1981 desperate project is still the world's best backup plan. The warning sirens blared again in 2011. Iran threatened the strait over nuclear sanctions. The UAE rushed its own pipeline. Massive canal blueprints were suddenly dragged out of filing cabinets. But then, the threat faded, and the blueprints went right back into the drawer. That became the fatal cycle. Iran threatens the strait, mega projects are urgently debated, the threat cools, the projects die. So the radical bypass ideas dominating headlines today, none of them are new. What's new is that time has finally run out. Because when you look at the master plans currently on the table, a grim reality emerges. We have a lot of $100 billion dreams and almost zero concrete. In 2008, Dubai proposed the ultimate escape route, a 180-kilometer canal slicing straight through the Hajar Mountains to bypass the strait entirely. On paper, it was a masterpiece. In reality, it was an engineering nightmare. This wasn't a trench in the sand. This meant carving through solid rock rising 2,300 feet above sea level. It demanded massive, explosive excavation, an unprecedented Panama-style lock system, and entirely new deep-water ports. The price tag? A staggering $200 billion. Before a single rock was blasted, the 2008 financial crisis hit. The mega canal died on the drawing board. The UAE settled for the cheap alternative, a standard crude oil pipeline to Fujairah. The project left behind a brutal lesson. The region was desperate enough to dream up a $200 billion escape hatch, but when the bill came due, they simply couldn't afford to dig it. If Dubai's mountain canal sounded extreme, Riyadh's 2015 proposal went even further. It was called the Salman Canal, a 950-kilometer waterway that, in theory, would connect the Persian Gulf directly to the Red Sea by cutting across the Arabian Peninsula. This was not just a bypass, it was an attempt to redraw the geography of Gulf energy exports. But geography does not negotiate. Fully loaded supertankers cannot simply be lifted over terrain rising more than 2,300 feet above sea level. The project would have required a vast lock system, deep water ports, rail links, and supporting infrastructure on a national scale. And that is where the numbers stopped making sense. The base estimate was around $80 billion, but once the full logistics network was added, the real cost could rise toward $250 billion. Saudi Arabia showed some interest, but the project never moved beyond the study phase. In the end, it became another mega plan that looked powerful on paper and impossible in practice. Then there is a smaller but in some ways more strategic target, the Musandam Peninsula. The idea was simple: cut through the northern tip of Oman and create a shorter route around the Strait of Hormuz. But this was not some new breakthrough. Strategists had been looking at the same geographic shortcut since the 1970s, and an old idea is not the same thing as a real project. For decades, there was no serious feasibility study, no funded engineering program, and no path to construction. Musandam remained less a plan than a recurring geopolitical concept. Then came March 2026. Once Iran moved to choke off Hormuz, the Musandam Canal surged back into public discussion, carrying estimated costs as high as $200 billion. And that number tells you something important. This is not a construction-ready lifeline. It is a measure of desperation. It shows how exposed the global energy market has become when a half-century-old concept suddenly starts to look like an urgent survival plan. Then there's the Gulf Railway, the ultimate overland bypass. Approved in 2009, this massive rail network was supposed to link all 6 Gulf states together. It sounded like the perfect modern solution. Except for 2 massive problems. First, they can't seem to finish it. The 2018 deadline came and went. Then 2021. Now they are aiming for 2030, with huge stretches of desert still waiting for tracks. But even if it were magically finished tomorrow, it wouldn't matter. And this is the brutal truth about the Gulf Railway. Trains are great for shipping containers, electronics, and food. They are mathematically useless for replacing supertankers. You cannot load 20 million barrels of crude oil onto a train every single day. Strip away the mega canal fantasies, and the reality is terrifyingly thin. Today, exactly 2 backup systems are actually functioning. The first is Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline. On paper, it's a beast. In reality, the Yanbu port can't load ships fast enough to match the pipe. But here is the fatal flaw. Any tanker heading to Asia escapes Hormuz, only to sail straight into the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. You are bypassing one choke point, just to enter a live war zone hunted by Houthi missiles. Escaping one trap to sail into another. The second is the UAE's Habshan-Fujairah line. It's simply too small to handle normal exports. And in a modern conflict, a 200-mile fixed pipe is nothing but a sitting duck for drone strikes. When you push both of these pipelines to their absolute physical limits, you rescue about 6 million barrels a day. The math is brutal. That leaves a 14 million barrel black hole in the global market every single day, with absolutely nowhere to go. The Strait of Hormuz was never just a shipping lane, it was a trillion-dollar gamble. The Gulf states built an entire energy empire on the blind assumption that the most concentrated oil bottleneck on Earth would simply stay open forever. But every single mega project in this video proves one thing. Someone, somewhere, knew exactly how fragile that gamble was. The blueprints were drawn, the billions were available, but arrogance won. Instead of pouring concrete, they just held meetings. And after half a century of warnings, the wealthiest nations on Earth built exactly 2 inadequate pipelines. Neither is big enough to stop the bleeding, and both point straight into a second war zone. The era of theoretical warnings is dead. The trap is finally sprung. Now that panic has replaced planning, out of all these impossible mega canals, railways, and desert trenches, which one do you think they are desperate enough to actually build first? Drop your answer in the comments.